11 million tons of agricultural chemicals are poured onto America's vast farmland every year. They quietly poison the nation's waterways from the mighty Mississippi to the small creeks of the West. One can notice how life becomes sparse and exhausted in these zones. But this is just the beginning. People tried something unprecedented by releasing a few beavers back into these places. Why did the unexpected happen? The environmental damage appeared absolute, but the small natural engineer, once dismissed by humans, began to change everything. At first glance, they work without a plan, but in reality, they act with purpose. With no blueprints, no funding, and no construction permits, they need only teeth, mud, and a few branches. It is visible how they build structures capable of reshaping entire landscapes. It gets more complex further on. Can this creature really pull an ecosystem back from the brink of collapse? The journey of revival begins here. 2 billion tons of waste are released by humanity into the environment every single year. This includes nearly 50 million tons of plastic and over 100 million tons of industrial chemicals. These substances quietly flow into rivers, pushing waterways that once supported civilizations into global decline. But this story isn't happening only in the United States. Nowhere is this clearer than on the Mississippi, the nation's main artery. One can notice how the river drains 40% of the United States, carrying the wastewater of 31 states. Every summer, the current delivers massive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus into the Gulf of Mexico. This influx creates the infamous dead zone. Why is this area classified as dead? At first glance, the water surface looks normal, but in reality, oxygen levels fall so low that almost no bottom-dwelling creature can survive. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2023, this oxygen-starved area expanded to 3,058 square miles, nearly the size of Delaware. And this is not the limit. Worse still, human engineering has altered the river structure. More than a century of damming, channelizing, and draining wetlands has stripped away nearly 50% of the upper Mississippi's floodplain forests. It is visible how the lower Mississippi has shrunk to only about 30% of its original extent. The water no longer has room to spread. Consequently, this once life-giving giant has become a machine for producing floods. The disaster of 1927 caused damage equivalent to more than $25 billion today. It remains one of the most devastating natural catastrophes in American history. The river moves forward, carrying the history of these changes. 0.2 degrees per decade is the precise rate at which the Earth heats up. This constant rise dries out forests, making vegetation highly flammable, while rivers grow exhausted from pollution. In 2023 alone, over 2,690,000 acres burned in the United States. Why is this trend so destructive? It seems like a minor statistic, but the economic damage hits $893 billion every year. One can notice how ash falls into streams from California to Canada, turning the water dark. Fertile soil is scorched away, and water flows become erratic. It gets more complex further on. At first glance, the climate shift seems subtle, but in reality, humidity drops and winds grow stronger. Climate change intensifies everything, and it is visible how a single spark turns into a catastrophe within hours. Forests disappear and wetlands collapse under the heat. The rivers, already weakened, are pushed closer to breaking. 60 million North American beavers were hunted to near extinction between the 17th and late 19th centuries for their fur. By the early 1900s, only a few hundred survivors remained in remote wetlands. One can notice the rivers weakening and breaking without these natural engineers. But this is just the beginning. A force once thought lost to history has quietly returned. Their absence left a deep void in the wild, Why did ecologists prioritize this species in the mid-2000s? The link to fire safety was not immediately clear. Scientists realized that the disappearance of beavers caused streams to dry up faster and wildfires to spread more easily. In 2008, the Methow Beaver Project restored populations across the North Cascades. Teams use humane traps and health checks before moving animals from residential areas. At first glance, this seems simple, but in reality, it targets degraded watersheds. It is visible how beavers enter the terrain. Transition to the next level. The massive wildfire of 2014 created a unique experiment. The destruction provided a blank test site. 8 pairs were released into 3 burned-out basins. 1 year later, all survived the winter and built more than 15 new dams. One can see how the blackened valleys turned green in just a few seasons. The environment slowly begins to heal itself. $1.2 million. That was the budget allocated for a hydraulic dam project in the Czech Republic. The construction remained stalled for 7 years due to paperwork. While officials waited, a single beaver colony built a barrier in the exact location engineers had planned. The structure created a pond and restored wetland conditions so effectively that authorities admitted the animals did the job for free. But this is just the beginning. Why do ecologists officially classify these rodents as ecosystem engineers? It seems they are simply dragging branches. But every log a beaver holds in its mouth sets the stage for a scale of rebuilding no other animal can achieve. The flow of restoration starts here. The dams they construct do not block the water completely. Instead, the barriers slow the velocity, allowing the stream to spill sideways and soak deep into the soil. One can notice how sediments trap nutrients within just a few weeks. Reeds take root alongside sprouting willows and aspens. Insects return in waves of renewal, filling the air above the water. It gets more complex further on. These engineered ponds become critical oases in otherwise dry landscapes. At first glance, the dam looks like a chaotic pile of debris, but in reality, it acts as a sophisticated stabilizer. Riverbanks are reinforced naturally, without the need for excavators or concrete. Mule deer, moose, grouse, and mallards stop here to rest. Small fish find refuge among the submerged branches, while countless bird species patrol the surface. Ecologists identify them as a keystone species, a pillar preventing the entire system from collapsing. Thus, the landscape heals itself through these persistent efforts, creating a balanced environment across the seasons. 300 beavers were reintroduced by ecologists into the upper Methyl River, starting in the year 2008. Why rely on animals to manage water in these drought-stricken valleys? It would seem logical to use heavy machinery to build predictable reservoirs, but the beavers perform the job for free, creating a network of ponds that would cost humans millions of dollars to replicate. This ecological transformation is only gaining momentum. Within just a decade, researchers recorded 176 new ponds. One can notice how these natural reservoirs capture the flow, permanently altering the landscape. On average, a single beaver dam holds about 1 million gallons of surface water. The first 62 ponds alone stored nearly 5 million gallons. And this is not the limit. The entire network now retains more than 65 million gallons of water annually, a volume sufficient to supply a household in Twist for more than 20 years. Benefits extend far beyond surface water. A study in the Columbia River Basin found that 29 beaver ponds added 6.6 million gallons of groundwater. It does not end at this stage. At first glance, the dams seem to block the water completely, but in reality, they spread it out across the valley floor. This structural feature allows the liquid to seep into the soil and recharge the aquifers below. In summer, the stored water releases slowly, keeping streams cooler and steadier even during peak heat. One can observe that streams without beavers often dry down to bare rock by the late season. Conversely, waterways with beavers still hold water and keep the surrounding grass green. Thus, the restored ecosystem allows life to persist even through the harshest droughts without interruption. 3 times more moisture is retained in areas with beaver dams compared to places without them, according to a detailed 2020 analysis of satellite images by NASA. Why do these valleys remain green while surrounding landscapes crack from drought? It seems impossible amidst the intensifying heat, but the water held back by these dams creates a layer of protection scientists never expected. Surveys conducted across Washington and Idaho revealed that valleys inhabited by beavers appeared as fire-resistant oases. But this is just the beginning. This moisture retention significantly slows the spread of aggressive flames. During the 2015 Twist Fire, a stark visual contrast emerged as many ponds were scorched on one side while the other remained completely green. One can notice how firefighters even utilize the accumulated pond water to actively battle the blaze. It does not end at this stage. At first glance, a dam looks like a simple pile of wood, but in reality, the fire resilience comes from how these structures spread water across the landscape. The mechanism thoroughly soaks the soil and preserves a cool layer of mud beneath the surface. It is visible how this process creates damp depressions that the fire simply cannot consume. As a result, beaver ponds act as true ecological fortresses in the midst of increasingly severe fire seasons. Thus, life persists safely within the boundaries of these protected zones. 7 native salmon species in Washington face increasingly severe fire seasons. Yet, the resilient life around beaver ponds tells a story of recovery. An iconic fish, once pushed to the edge, is being pulled back from the brink. Why have these populations plummeted over the past 40 years? The human footprint expanded drastically across the region. The answer is that floodplains shrank while the state's population grew by 63% from 1990 to 2020. Puget Sound alone has lost more than 1/3 of its natural shoreline. One can notice how concrete squeezes the streams, causing Chinook and coho numbers to decline by 70 to 90% due to warming waters. But this is just the beginning of the environmental shift. Hope has emerged from small engineers. Since 2014, the Tulalip Beaver Project has reintroduced more than 200 beavers into creeks in the northern Puget region. At first glance, this seems like a minor biological addition, but in reality, these animals reconstruct the entire hydraulic system. They build long chains of cool ponds, creating up to 12 or 13 consecutive dams. It is visible how the slowed flow produces swarms of insects that young salmon depend on for food. Ecologists have documented hundreds of juveniles returning to places once written off as dead streams. The water brings life back to the channel without haste. More than 150 relocations were executed in 2023 alone to reverse ecological damage. Why rely on a species known for damaging levees for such precise restoration? At first glance, beavers seem like mere troublemakers that cut down trees and flood yards. But the state decided to turn these exact instincts into a primary force for natural recovery. Historically, suppression pushed them to the edge of extinction, leaving them surviving only in remote wetlands. Instead of continuing the cycle of extermination, programs like the Methow Beaver Project and the Tulalip Beaver Initiative now function as ecosystem reconstruction teams. They respond to every call about nuisance activity with a strict protocol. One can notice how the teams humanely trap each animal rather than harming it. Specialists run detailed health checks before the next phase begins. But this is just the beginning of the process. Because the instinct to build is a critical resource, the animals are transported to depleted watersheds. It is visible how they construct dozens of new dam complexes that reshape the riverbeds. these barriers slow the streams and add vital shade. The water temperature drops, reopening lost migration corridors for juvenile salmon. And this is not the limit of the transformation. Places once written off as dead streams finally regain their natural rhythms of life. Tens of millions of beavers vanished from North America because of a single relentless demand for luxury materials. For nearly 3 centuries, their ultrafine underfur drove a hunting frenzy that fueled the production of felt hats across Europe. Few people realized that the value of a single pelt was high enough to nearly erase the entire species from the continent. To understand this revival, one must look inside the tannery, where workers receive each dried hide as a specialized commodity. Every piece gets an assigned identification code made of tiny punched holes for precise supplier tracking. The hides immediately move into a rehydration vat filled with a solution of salt water. Specialized chemicals work for more than 12 hours to restore the original moisture to the material. But this is just the beginning. From these freshly rehydrated pelts, the refinement moves into a stage demanding absolute precision. One can notice how the hides are bent over a wooden beam or fed into a specialized machine to soften each fiber. This mechanical action opens the structure of the dermis, allowing the leather to breathe again. Without this intervention, treatment solutions would fail to penetrate deep enough into the tissue. The process is only gaining momentum. Why is the subsequent flushing stage so critical for the final quality? To the untrained eye, the hide already looks consistent and ready for treatment. However, the tanner must shave off the first thick layer of tissue to remove coarse material and create a surface accurate to the millimeter. The pelt is then placed into a second soaking bath using a carefully calibrated degreasing solution. It must be strong enough to remove all natural oils without damaging the delicate hair follicles. Even the slightest amount of residual fat can cause the leather to rot or discolor over time. Once lifted from the vat, the hide is fleshed again to thin out dense areas like the shoulders and tail. This step defines the softness, durability, and flawless coloration of the finished leather. At first glance, removing guard hairs seems like a routine manual scraping task, but in reality, it is the most delicate stage of the entire process. The tanner immerses the pelt in a formulated solution that loosens only the guard hair roots without touching the ultrafine underfur beneath. This ratio must be perfectly exact. When the hide reaches the ideal level of open, it is placed over a beam where every guard hair is carefully scraped out. One wrong motion or one broken hair turns the entire pelt into a worthless reject instantly. A mistake here results in a financial loss of several $1,000s. The precision achieved during plucking clears the way for finishing the leather structure. Transition to the next level. The pelt enters a pickle solution to tighten the grain and lock the underfur roots in place before being shaved again to the exact thickness. Workers move the hide into the wet tanning phase to stabilize fibers before drying. Inside the rotating drum, powerful cycles break up stiff fibers, creating the signature softness and drape. One can notice how the hide stretches to open the grain. With the structure fully open, the material receives a layer of tanning oil applied evenly. A specialized pounding machine presses the oil deep into the fiber, restoring natural flexibility, sheen, and durability. For sheared beaver orders, the trimmer guides the pelt through precision blades to adjust the length and direction of the fur. Finally, the hide is bleached, cleaned, and tumbled for hours, achieving the luster needed for the fashion workshop. Perfect smoothness and high luster are required before the material moves on to the fashion workshop. One can notice the surface quality before the focus shifts to the humble dams and newly revived streams. Beavers stand as proof that nature holds wonders never fully understood. But this is just the beginning. Why do these creatures act as catalysts for recovery? It might seem they are merely building homes, They do not just restore fading waterways, they awaken entire ecosystems long thought forgotten. Every bite they take and every surge of water they redirect brings new life. At first glance, the process looks subtle, but in reality, birds return and fish find shelter in the new pools. Vegetation rises again, breaking through the soil after years of drought. It is visible how the landscape transforms under their persistent influence. Thus, a small creature reshapes the fate of an entire territory.